How should Christians engage the culture today? And to what extent should the church engage politically? Of course, it's a major election year, and many Christians are wondering how to think through the issues and the church's role. I'm Richard Nelson, host of the Commonwealth Matters, and joining us to talk further is Dr. Stephen Presley, a professor of church history at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's also currently regularly researches and writes on topics of Christian cultural engagement. And his latest book is called Cultural Sanctification, Engaging the World Like the Early Church. Stephen, welcome to the Commonwealth Matters.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Hey, I think we should start with this book of yours. By the way, I had a chance to read some of it, not all of it, but I find the title fascinating. Cultural Sanctification, Engaging the World Like the Early Church. So let's start with the basic definition. What do you mean by cultural sanctification?
First of all, the title comes from a couple different sources. The first is there's a book on the history of missiology by a very famous missiologist named Andrew Walls. And he describes how the church, wherever it finds itself historically and even today, enters a culture. The church, takes up residence within that culture. It always operates with kind of two principles. The first is what he calls an indigenizing principle, where the church is embedding itself in the world and becomes active within the structures of that culture. The second is a pilgrim principle, where the church is always kind of living as it expects the coming of the kingdom of God that is to come in the future. So you're always operating in that kind of tension. And then there was a book written that sort of captured those two ideas and under the rubric of cultural sanctification. And Vince Bantu's book is the book that he's a professor down at Fuller. And he wrote this book and he captured those two under the vision of cultural sanctification. And I kind of drew on that because as I observed, beginning in the book of Acts and then on through, like Andrew Walls talks about in the history of missiology, the church is always trying to navigate those tensions. And I'm situated in a time where the church feels pulled in certain directions. And so the book is trying to hang together those two separate principles with a vision of sanctifying the culture in which they find themselves.
Thank you for that definition. As I read it, by the way, I forgot to mention, Stephen, that you're a professor at Southern Seminary in Louisville, and your background is in church history. So we have the man here to talk about church history, and it really gives a lot of great insight on this topic. But Stephen, as I looked at the title, I thought, this might, some Christians or some might be thinking, is this the social gospel? In the old definition of how it was used, right? The social gospel in the early 1900s, where you saw this rift between the mainline churches and the conservative Bible-believing churches, and the mainline churches drifted in this direction of just works. Let's just focus on human needs, feeding the poor, clothing the naked, that kind of thing. But this is not what you're talking about, is it?
Absolutely not. I mean, that is sort of the classical liberal understanding of the role of faith and in society. The way, and particularly evangelicalism has emphasized in the 20th century, the importance of personal faith, the importance of the feeling of conviction that ought to drive one's vision of life in the world. But as, the challenge we face now on the other end of the collapsing of institutions all over the place, be it educational institutions, be it political institutions, be it the family, all of these institutions are under pressures, and suddenly kind of recovering the emphasis of the way one's faith shapes one's life in the world is something I notice happening in the early church. In the book, I talk about it, but also something that I think we need to recover today. And it sounds like I know the work that you all are doing kind of fits with that vision on the positive side of it. This is kind of a demonstration of the importance of faith for one's active life.
Stephen, early on in your book, you talk about how the church shaped individuals. There was the catechesis, It was a process. The soul was shaped through a process, beginning with God, beginning with the teaching of the church, as opposed, in contrast to in the 19th and 20th century, there was mass evangelism. There were revivals, revivalism, if you will. Let's talk about that for a minute, because I'm wondering if, because of our current cultural context of how people are introduced to the faith and how they're catechized or not catechized compared to the early church, I think this is an important starting point in this conversation.
Yeah, this is what I have seen and what I have read. And by the way, a lot of this connects with, in addition to the work I do at the seminary at Southern, uh, I work for the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. And a lot of this, and I do a lot of work with pastors there as well as training pastors at the seminary. And I see what's happening within religious communities on the ground. And I see what's happened historically in the 20th century, even in the period of revivals. We enjoyed institutions that had embedded sort of moral framework, to use the image of marriage. I mean, we had a definition of marriage that was holding the culture together. We had certain institutions, and the revivalism was trying to revive and hold those institutions accountable in certain ways, churches, denominations, political organizations, those kind of things. But now, as our institutions are under struggle, um, Christians, I think, and this is what I argue in that first chapter, have to relearn what are those primary moral principles that guide us. Why? What do the scriptures? And in the early church, I mean, it's a little shocking to a lot of people, but I point out, at least in a couple documents, it looks like years of discipleship before baptism, because the church said, in order to conduct one's life in society, in order to be a good citizen, you need to conduct your life according to the teachings of scriptures. And that takes time to learn. So we've benefited from institutions that have been built upon sort of Christian mores. We're losing those institutions and now having to relearn what does it mean to be a Christian citizen once again, as people are trying to live in society. And like I said, I know you see this constantly on the ground, especially in the work y'all are doing.
Stephen, today, many identify as Christian. Here in Kentucky, the number's upwards of 70% of citizens identify as Christians. A couple years ago, self-identified evangelicals were at a high point. And yet many of these self-identified evangelicals weren't part of a church. They weren't active in a small group, but they just identified. And my suspicion, and I think others have commented on this, is that it was a politicized definition of what an evangelical was, in contrast to what you were sharing. A Christian in the early church was catechized over a period of years before they were even baptized.
Yeah. I think a good example of this might be from one example I give briefly in the book is from Acts, a couple episodes of Acts, and then on in the early church. You have like the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. And what does the Ethiopian eunuch do? He's reading Isaiah 53. And Philip comes along and, he asks a question all of us who are people of faith long to ask, who is the person this is talking about? And of course, it's Christ. And then unlocks just a beautiful, what the text seems to imply is just a beautiful demonstration of Christ's fulfillment of the Old Testament. But then you go to Paul on Mars Hill in Acts, 17. And Paul is sitting there with a bunch of philosophers, and Paul has to begin at ground zero. I mean, he's got to begin with, how many gods are there? And once you answer that question, now you can start to build a biblical worldview, a biblical vision of life that flows from one God who has formed us and fashioned us and made us in his image. The problem was with the Greco-Roman mindset, you had to begin at ground zero. And you had to learn the basic contours of the faith and then the morality that flows from those basic theological assumptions.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean, are we not at that place again in postmodern, post-Christian culture today, where there is no shared moral reference point? And you mentioned this in your book, but there is no shared understanding of transcendence, of a fixed truth. Where does morality come from? It's a free for all out there. Are we not in a similar place that Paul was in some 2,000 years ago?
Absolutely. And we are absolutely, and I cite a couple works. There's Ferdinand Mont, the great British political commentator, has a book called Full Circle, How the Romans World Came Back to Us. And he has a paragraph I cite in the book where he just shows the moral diversity of the ancient world. Anything, any appetite you have that you want to entertain, it's available to you. And then he just says, it's hard to imagine a time more akin to that than our own. And absolutely, you look around at the moral diversity. There is no coherence. There is no transcendent moral order that we're all trying to live under. Instead, we're competing. We're in the public square and we're competing.
Stephen, you use the term appetite, and I think that is a good term for us today, here in the United States anyway, where we have insatiable appetites without any limits, whether it is for food. I mean, look, we're advertised all this good food, but then there's diet drugs. We have uncontrolled appetites when it comes to wealth and pleasure and human sexuality, all of these appetites that are unrestrained, if you will. Was the message of the early church to restrain, or maybe better put, to correctly order our appetites?
It's absolutely, you see it in the chapter on catechesis. I talk about a long tradition called the two ways tradition. And it reminds you just of like the Robert Frost poem, two roads diverged in the yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled by. This vision of a spiritual life that is also, I think, expressed in the Sermon on the Mount, that was this calling, this high calling of the spiritual life. And it wasn't always, you need to live in accordance with the laws. No, you need to seek virtue that transcends the laws. You need to be the best citizens. You need to be the best people. That's the path of the cross. That's the path to walk. And so the church, it stressed the importance of the spiritual life, embedded and lived. It did not neglect. I mean, you just hit on the importance of sin and the importance of the early church understanding a healthy doctrine of sin, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that affects all institutions that are formed and fashioned. But the calling of the church is a calling to be a people of virtue, to bring those appetites into submission of the moral vision that is expressed in the scriptures and that flows from a correct understanding of a doctrine of God.
And if I could add to that, of the fundamental appetite that God made us for is for Him. We're made to walk with God. We're made to be in communion with God. And when we fill ourselves with other things and make other things in our lives primary and foremost, the result is we deform our souls. We become less like image bearers of God. And the early church taught that, hey, there is a creator who made you in his image. He made you to walk with him, but you're broken. You are a sinner separated from God the Father. But the good news is that Jesus came to take your sins and to take your disordered appetites and to make things right again so that you could walk with God as you were intended to do. I mean, that's the message of the church, is it not?
It is. And I do, in a couple of those, the chapter, I talk a little bit about conversion, some of the conversion experiences. And just to cite a few, I mean, one, I'd mentioned Justin Martyr, for example, an early Christian apologist, a second century apologist. And Justin talks about how when he was trying to seek out what is true, he dabbled in every known philosophical system. He tried out the Platonists, he tried out the Stoics, he tried out the Epicureans. Many of these are mentioned in the New Testament in Acts. And he tried them all out, and they all left him wanting because they all don't promote human flourishing. They don't ultimately satisfy the soul. And then the other one I mentioned is Augustine in the opening of his Confessions, a very famous work where Augustine says, right, the heart is restless until it rests in you. And Augustine himself pursued, he became a Manichaean, he pursued all kinds of philosophical things, but nothing satisfies like a life lived for God.
I started the Commonwealth Policy Center to help Christians to think biblically about the issues of the day. Hi, I'm Richard Nelson, and I just wrote a book of my nearly 3 decades of experience engaging politics and public policy. It's called Christianity and Politics, and it can be pre-ordered on Amazon beginning July the 15th. Have you ever thought about running for office, simply presenting in a public forum, or teaching your Sunday school class? This book is for you. Again, pre-release orders are on Amazon July the 15th. Please order it today. If you're just joining us, you're tuned into the Commonwealth Matters. I'm your host, Richard Nelson, with Dr. Stephen Presley, who recently wrote the book called Cultural Sanctification, Engaging the World Like the Early Church. Stephen, what a timely work. I want to pick up with something you said in your book. In you view, you have a statement about how the postmodern world sees Christianity. You say this: we're now in a postmodern world where Christianity is rejected as morally bankrupt, and most of the time still viewed as intellectually suspect. So why is the church considered morally bankrupt? Why do postmoderns see the church as morally bankrupt?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it sort of goes back to some of our discussion about classical liberalism in the 19th century and that mission of a social gospel. If you go back, I mean, their vision of the social gospel, however misguided, was still kind of unified with Christian mores behind it. It was totally unsatisfying. And of course, you needed faith in addition to any kind of social reform. But we live in a world that is post any kind of moral unity, to the Tocquevillian vision of Christian mores being the fabric that held together our political and social life has evaporated. Now, the rise of postmodernism really comes after World War II. There's a very famous definition of postmodernism given by the French philosopher Lyotard, who argues that postmodernism is the incredulity of meta-narratives. And what he means by that is there essentially no one has the right to create universal norms. Well, the problem now for the church is it means that Christian vision of life is now competing in the public square against a whole range of moral norms. And even outside the church, they don't all agree. I mean, over what does it mean to be a human person? What does marriage look like? All those kinds of questions are floating around. And so you're really with a unified vision of the church that flows from a doctrine of God, who God is, that then shapes how we live, versus a whole range of visions of life, none of which are claiming or desire to claim any kind of universal or transcendence. At least that's not what they say.
We're lacking a unified moral vision and a foundation by which to do life together. But if you look at how this is working out for us, there is so much brokenness in our nation today. The addiction crisis, depression and anxiety, especially with young people, suicide, second leading cause of death in teenagers, certain breakdown of the teenage group, a breakdown in family and personal relationships. We're not doing very well in this postmodern world. So, Stephen, there's brokenness all around us. That's clear. Not dissimilar from the brokenness in the early church. Might have been some different kind of brokenness, but it was really broken in the Roman culture back then, wasn't it? So here's the question. The brokenness back then, 2,000 years ago, there's brokenness today. What advice would you have for the church? Where do we begin when we look out and see the brokenness, broken people with addiction issues, with relational issues, with just so many dysfunctions today? Where do we begin?
I'll say two points, and these are two different chapters in the book. First, we need a level of discernment, and I talk a lot about what I call a cultural discernment. And that is, when I look at the early church, And it's not unlike when I talk to, I've done some teaching with missionaries heading overseas, going into like far unreached people. And they set themselves down in a culture that is in no way influenced by Christianity. They immediately have to discern, how can I live my spiritual life in ways that are faithful and flourishing? How do I live my spiritual life in this pagan world, in this different world, in this world that's not distinctively Christian? And I think that harnesses the Christian understanding of discernment. And I think you need to be discerning in almost every area of your life, discerning with technology, discerning with your family, discerning with your participation in all kinds of social activities. Doesn't mean we're always going to agree, but Christians need to have those kinds of conversations. What does it mean to live Christianly? How do I participate in the civic sphere? So discernment is one. The other one is hope. And I end with the theological virtue of hope. And I argue that at the end of the day, the brokenness is solved through the relationship with Christ and the hope that comes through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I talk about a Christian hope of Christ coming again, especially. And I note how in the early church, they never fell on despair. They never, and it's so easy. Believe me, I have kids, and you look at the brokenness. It is so easy to fall into just, I really can't make a difference. But and you notice, I talk about this in the chapter on hope. The Roman mindset didn't really have hope. What did a Roman hope for? Live a good life? The expansion of the empire? There's no hope. Along comes Christianity and says, hey, you can have a good life, and Christ is going to come again in glory to judge the living, the dead, and establish a kingdom that has no end. And it was hope, that theological virtue, that resonated. So I think those two, a discernment and kind of a hope, that guides us.
Thanks for sharing that, Stephen. That is an example of the kind of hope that Polycarp had and many of the church fathers had, and yet they didn't have civil rights like we did. This widespread understanding of human rights, right, or the rule of law, innocent until proven guilty. There's certain things that we take for granted. We can vote, right? We can participate in elections and have a say as to who governs us. The early church didn't have that. And they lived in a pagan context. In the case of Polycarp and the early church fathers, many were martyred for the faith. They were asked to recant and to reject their faith. And yet their hope outweighed any of the prevailing cultural notions, the powers that be. What an example for us today. Nobody's been dragged before the Supreme Court of the United States and asked to recant. Nobody has lost the ability to freely worship in our country today. And yet it seems to me that we're freaking out. And when we shouldn't, and I get it. And I don't want our listeners to misunderstand me. I understand the cultural moment that we're in, and I understand the urgency. But Stephen, tell me if I'm wrong. If we freak out and if we're simply reactive and hopeless, what's that saying to the larger culture? What's it saying about our faith?
I mean, it is. Yeah, there's so many things I could say here, because it's in some way, I've often cited this, because I remember not long ago, I was reading just a random book on time management, Atomic Habits by James Clear. And he kind of quotes at the beginning, to write a good book, you got to become the book. And it kind of stuck with me, because I had just sort of finished writing this book, and the ways it impacted me. And as even writing it was just giving me a sense of, you know what? I truly do believe in the transcendence of God. I do believe in the providence of God. I do believe, I don't understand why things are happening, maybe in the way that they are happening. But it speaks to the wider world. When we walk with confidence and we walk with hope, even through suffering, even through hardship, It demonstrates the confidence and the beauty of the gospel. And I do point out, too, in the book, exactly what you said, that we're in a different position than the early church because we do have the opportunities to express our faith in the public sphere in all the ways you said. And one other thing, it's like something like Tom Holland's book, Dominion, where Holland demonstrates the beautiful things the church has created. There's lots of things we could talk about, the problems the church has been involved with. But if you look at the governments, the academic institutions, all the different ways Christianity have influenced positively, there's a legacy we can draw on, even the early church and church history today, to see we can be active in the public square and we can demonstrate our faith with confidence and hope, even when it looks difficult. But you're absolutely right. I have kids. I feel the pressures every day to maintain hope in the midst of a lot of despair.
Stephen Presley, thank you so much for joining us on the Commonwealth Matters. Your book, Cultural Sanctification, Engaging the World Like the Early Church, trust it can be found on Amazon and all the other outlets.
Yep, definitely.
Great read. And thank you all for tuning in to the Commonwealth Matters. If you could, please go to your favorite podcast platform and rate us, and then tell your friends about us as well. Until next time, may God bless you.